Hi, everyone. Welcome to Rare New England's Medical Genetics Career Fairs. My name is Nicole White, and I am the Executive Director of Rare New England. I am going to share my screen quickly. All right. Rare New England's mission is to bring together New England patients, families, and providers touched by rare and complex disorders. We offer educational opportunities, create awareness of available resources, and build foundations for support to improve patient quality of life and support the professional needs of healthcare providers. For tonight's career fair, we have our host, Dr. Amy Kritzer. She works at the Division of Genetics and Genomics at Boston Children's Hospital. We all have our guest speaker, Dr. Jonathan Picker. He's the CEO of Anuva, affiliate clinical geneticist at Boston Children's Hospital, director of the Fragile X program, and genomics Boston Children's Hospital assistant professor at Harvard Medical School. Our next guest speaker is Dr. Gerald Cox. He's the board certified geneticist at Boston Children's Hospital and founder of Gerald Cox Rare Care Consulting. Finally, our next guest speaker is Brian Skotko, Dr. Brian Skotko, forgive me, board certified medical geneticist and Emma Campbell endowed chair on Down syndrome at Mass General Hospital. And of course, we would like to thank our sponsors for helping us make this program happen. We appreciate you all very much. And I will hand it over to our host for this evening, Dr. Kritzer.
Hi, would like to start by thanking everybody for attending our career fair today. We have a very exciting hour planned. So as Nicole said, I'm Amy Kritzer. I am a physician who originally trained in pediatrics and really wanted to focus my career on the care of children with complex medical needs and their families. And this led me to a career in clinical genetics and biochemical genetics, where I get to support and advocate for these children and their families every day. And I would love to welcome everybody to this event. So, why are we doing this? Genetics is impacting all areas of medicine at this point in time. So as you can imagine, there's a growing need for geneticists in this country and abroad. And patients and families come to genetics for various reasons. Some come looking for a diagnosis. Some come looking for information about their diagnosis, information about their futures, medical complications that could come down the line. Couples come due to a family history of having a genetic disease in the family and wanting to know what that might mean for their future children. And families come looking for therapeutics and knowing what is on the horizon in terms of treatment for these genetic diseases. There are over 7,000 rare diseases and growing. Many, but not all, are genetic. And so there's a lot of information that needs to be shared, both with patients and families, but also within the medical community. And genetics, not only is it about single genes, but genetics also impacts how we manifest disease, how we respond to disease, how our bodies utilize medications, and what therapies are going to be possible for treating different disorders. So tonight you're going to hear from 3 geneticists who all have tremendous experience in the field. You'll hear a bit about what they're doing, how they came into this field, how their experience helps them treat their families, patients, and how that's impacted other aspects of how they've chosen to pursue other areas that are important to patients with these rare diseases. We will have a Q&A session that will follow the presentations. So thank you to anyone who submitted questions ahead of time, and there'll also be opportunities to put questions in the chat or in the Q&A box, so that if you didn't get a chance to submit a question, you will have an opportunity to do so in the future. So we're going to ask each of our presenters to first take an opportunity to share with you a little bit about themselves and their work. So we will start with Dr. Jonathan Picker.
Thank you, Amy, and thanks to all of you for tuning in. I think you make an excellent choice in considering genetics. I know we have limited time, so I'm gonna get started right off. Fairly quick background. Although an American, as a child, my family moved to Scotland and I went to medical school there, moved down to England and did a PhD in molecular biology, actually in an agriculture faculty. They had a very interesting project, understanding gene regulation, but moved back here to come back to medicine to undertake training in clinical genetics. Now, I did that at Boston Children's Hospital and still have an affiliation there, but was largely full-time for the next 20 years. My particular area of interest was neurobehavioral development and the disorders that are associated with it. And the reason for this really, I think, reflects why I came into genetics in the first place. And that goes back to when I was 14. And that's when I realized I wanted to be a geneticist. I was going along like all of us, of all the fascinating things you can do. Somebody told me about the flatworm planaria and how if you cut the planaria or it got damaged, so part of the body became dissociated, it would just regenerate that part and carry on. If you cut the head in half, well, the two halves would grow the missing half and you'd now have a two-headed planaria. And I was fascinated by this. I thought, how is this possible? What on earth is going on? And at a more fundamental level, what does this mean about life? Well, simplistically, I got a magnifying glass to try to find them in puddles, not understanding how small they were. More importantly, though, it started the chain of events that led me to the realization that if I want to understand life, I want to understand who we are, how we become the way we are, and what through this we can do to help people, then I really had to understand the code that explains it all, and that's genetics. So that was the philosophical reason. Now, I also had a practical reason in that I am a pragmatist, and I wanted to do something that made a difference. And again, this idea that if we want to help people and to really solve the problems of medical care, maybe going to the root of the problem is the best way to do it. And so from both perspectives, genetics seemed like really the only choice. Now, as I say, I stayed in academic clinical medicine for many, many years, but I had expected, with the first genome being sequenced in 2003, that we would see advances that would impact many, many more of us than in fact we have to date. Certainly there have been some miraculous discoveries that have transformed life for some people. But for most people, and for most of my patients, truthfully, it's still limited what we can do for them. And it was that frustration that led me, together with some others, to found the company Anuva. Anuva is a company that's really looking at the genetics and genomics of diversity. And our thinking was that the Human Genome Project and the research that's carried on since then has discovered an enormous amount about people from European ancestry. And as I say, there have been important discoveries along the way, but we still haven't accelerated the breakthroughs. We also haven't addressed the majority of the world's population who are not of European ancestry. We reasoned, if you look at people from different groups, if you look at diversity, and by diversity, I don't mean something political or cultural, I mean genetic, we can really look at the similarities and differences. We can say, okay, people from England have this disorder and we see this genetic profile, but they're so similar. How do we pick out the genes that are important, the many, many variants that are just there and aren't relevant to the disorder in question? Well, if we take a look at somebody from somewhere totally different, Papua New Guinea, South America, wherever, maybe we can find the common genes. Now, we decided to focus on India. We went into India because of the caste system and the culture and the history of India. So for over 2,000 years, people have essentially been separated on their caste. And we now have over 4,000 relatively unique populations within one country. They come from common ancestry. Well, I guess we all do, but theirs is a little closer, but they're distinctly different. And there are differences in the disease profiles, and many of the characteristics of these individuals. And so we can go and look. In fact, from the rare disease perspective, there's over 10 million people in India who have rare disorders, most of whom have not yet been able to reach geneticists or anybody who can help them. So we developed this company, and we spent many years figuring out how to work in India and other places where the infrastructure is not as it is here in the United States or in Europe. And we're able to find people who have unique diseases or groups that have unique differences. And I'll give you some examples. There's a condition called Handy-Godu syndrome. This is a progressive degenerative form of arthritis that eventually incapacitates and even ends up being lethal for people from 2 villages in one part of South India. There's a related disorder in Swaziland near South Africa, but otherwise, as far as we know, nobody else in the world has this. But in this village, it's a dominant disorder, but nobody has investigated the genetics. We can go in and take a look. Now imagine, we can do this and hopefully find the gene. That's the first step towards being able to take a better approach towards treating them. But it also has an impact for so many more people, because what might it tell us about why arthritis forms in other people? And this is something where, helping people with rare diseases actually helps all of us, because there is a message within about how the pathways and the processes of the body work. First and foremost, though, is to help these individuals, but this is a secondary benefit. Now, as I said, I went in out of frustration at the lack of progress, and I realized one of the benefits of being a geneticist in the industry is that my non-scientific colleagues are focused on results. Yes, they're interested in why something happens, but they want to know why in terms of how it's going to make a difference, how we can turn this finding into something that can be used. And that push from these colleagues means we're able to do things much faster. And we're certainly seeing this. Now, as I say, that's one example. There are other examples. The people in India are less tolerant to obesity. Their body mass index, which is your height to weight ratio, 23 is the normal ratio for them. Anything above is abnormal. For people from Europe, it's 25. What are those 2-point differences? Well, we have a lot of evidence to suggest that there's a strong genetic component. If we can figure that out, we may be able to, again, identify new pathways that can tell us about why someone's predisposed to diabetes, why they're predisposed to heart disease. What does this mean for them? What does it mean for us? And again, what can we do with that information to create possibly new drugs or new diagnostic techniques? So this is why I'm in industry. Now, I maintain an appointment at Boston Children's Hospital, and I still have a clinic. I see patients with Fragile X, and I see patients with general genetics problems. That's critically important to me, partly because of my identity as a doctor, partly because I think it's important to stay anchored into why we're doing all of this. And there's no better way than to be seeing my patients and trying to help them and understanding what it is we need to do more for them. And so I think it's a very nice mix where we can hopefully move things forward. So why genetics? Well, I'll just end with saying, why not? What else would you do? So I'll stop there, and thank you for hearing me out.
I'm sure we will come back to you, Jonathan and Dr. Picker, with lots of questions, but we'll move on now to hear from Dr. Cox and his field of study.
Right. Thanks, Amy. So like Amy and Jonathan, I am also affiliated with Boston Children's Hospital. I'm a physician scientist by training. I have an MD and a PhD. And I came to Boston Children's to do my pediatrics and genetics training. And after seeing patients for a few years and learning about all the different types of genetic conditions that might exist, and then spending some time in the laboratory trying to identify genes that cause these conditions, it seemed natural to me to move on to trying to figure out how do we actually treat these patients that I see in the clinic. So a few years into my career, I had the opportunity to join a company called Genzyme, which was a leading biotechnology company at the time that has since been acquired by Sanofi. And while I was there, I was able to work on developing drugs for conditions that had no treatment available. And these were all rare genetic conditions that I felt very comfortable with. But of course, people that aren't in genetics, these diseases frankly scared them because they were so rare. They really didn't know anything about it. So it was actually a really nice combination where I could bring my genetics training and the company could train me in turn on how to get a drug developed. So there's, in general, two types of drugs. Most of the ones you've heard about are what we call approved drugs. These are ones that have gone through extensive animal testing, through testing in patients, and eventually are approved by the FDA. And if you ever take a prescribed drug and open up the carton, there'll be a piece of paper that has a font that's about 0.5 with lots of little writing. And essentially that includes all the information that has been gathered on the drug and thought to be important in order to have physicians and patients take the drug. And you can actually see what information was obtained in animal studies, how they determine the dosing, and ultimately what the clinical trial showed that the drug was safe and effective. And before a drug is approved, we call these investigational drugs. And if someone has an idea for how to treat a disease, you can't just find a patient and give them the drug. You actually have to show that you can make the drug consistently and in a purified manner, and that it's been tested in animals for safety and some evidence that the drug may work in a particular disease state. Once you get to that point, then you apply to the FDA to do testing in humans. And for rare diseases, usually we start off in patients themselves, although in other diseases, we may look at healthy volunteers to get an idea of what the dosing regimen should be. So that's where I come in as the drug development physician. The company literally hands me the drug and says, okay, now show that the drug works and that it's safe in patients. And by the way, figure out what the right dose is and how often it has to be given. So, I've done that for a number of diseases now. Most of these are in the metabolic area, what we call lysosomal storage disorders, where patients are missing a particular enzyme that's needed to break down certain foodstuffs or molecules within the cell. And many of these diseases, they have very different clinical manifestations. They can affect children, they can affect adults, and we need to figure out how do we show that these patients derive clinical benefit? Do they improve the way they feel? Are they functioning better? Or in serious diseases, are we improving their survival? And so every disease is different, which is what is really attractive to me, because every of these diseases has a different pathway that you follow to show that the drug is safe and effective. So I did that for several years when I was at Genzyme. Several of the drugs I worked on are now approved and patients have access to them, which is a really great feeling. And then about 4 years ago, I decided that I wanted to branch out on my own and not work for a company, but actually do medical consulting. And so I do consulting now for small companies, generally biotech companies that are developing treatments for rare genetic diseases. You heard from Amy that there's 7,000 diseases, but treatments only for about 500. So, there's a lot of opportunity to develop new drugs. And what I like is that these little companies, they usually spring up out of hospitals or academia, and they have very interesting new technologies that they use to treat diseases. And so I've had access to using monoclonal antibodies, gene editing, nonsense mutation read through, treatments for protein refolding diseases, a whole host of novel treatments that for me is very exciting to figure out, how to design the clinical trial to show that the drug works. And once you complete the clinical trials, then we submit all the data to the FDA and they review it. They usually have questions about it. And then if they become satisfied that the benefits of the drug outweigh any kind of safety issues there may be, then they approve it and patients can get access to it. I'd say a big difference between industry and academia is that in industry, I don't do this all by myself. I have a team that I work with. We have people that are very experienced at conducting clinical trials. I may design them, but I don't necessarily know how to set up a clinical site and make sure that people are following the study protocol and that, we're not taking too much blood or, how we're going to standardize some of the assessments. That's all done by clinical operations specialists. And then there are people who are regulatory specialists who interact with the FDA. You can't just call up the FDA and say, what do you think about this or that? You have to actually schedule specific meetings with them. So we have people who specialize in that. And then we have statisticians that help us determine if the study is the right size or how many patients we need or how long we should keep the study going for. So in industry, you're really part of a team, which I really like. I always enjoyed team sports like basketball and baseball. Everyone has their specific role, their specific expertise that work together. And I like learning from other people. I'd say in academia, when you run a laboratory or you see patients, you're the main person. You're really literally the captain of the ship. And in a research lab, you have to write research grants. No one is going to do that for you, and oversee a group of people in the laboratory. So I think everyone, has their own unique personality and what makes them tick. And for me, I really like the camaraderie of teamwork and working together as a group in industry to bring new drugs to patients. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Such a fabulous perspective that you've just shared. And I'm sure we're going to come back to you with questions shortly too. And now I'm going to ask Dr. Skotko to join us and share his experience in his field of practice.
Thanks, Amy. It's great to be here. And again, thanks for everyone tuning in. What I love is you have 4 different geneticists who all practice genetics in a little bit of different ways. And I hope that is evident after we talk, because genetics is a field that you could do so much with. My own pathway is I received my residency in pediatrics, and then I went on to do a fellowship in medical genetics. I knew I always wanted to be a medical geneticist, in part because I have a sister with Down syndrome. So she was a motivating force. And I wanted to make sure that my future in practicing medicine was somehow centered around her and people with a condition similar to hers. So after I finished my fellowship in genetics, I went on to MGH, where I currently am, and I'm the director of the Down syndrome program there. In addition, I do also have a general medical genetics practice. But I thought I'd just share with you a practical day in the life of me. What does it look like to be someone like me? And I'm just going to describe my day today. And then I'm going to give you some tips on how you could size up how geneticists kind of break up their days. So I am an academic medical geneticist who both sees patients and also does clinical research. And what does that mean? It means I don't see patients full time. I don't do research full time, but I try to do both together to make a full-time position. So this morning I went in, and from 8 to noon today, I saw patients in my general genetics clinic. These were patients that I needed to spend about 2 hours yesterday in order to prepare for. So when I saw them today, they would be ready to go, and I knew what the game plan was. Yesterday, I had communicated in advance with the genetic counselor who would be working with me, and also with the student in genetic counseling who would be joining me today. I knew this morning I had multiple people that I needed to make sure had a good experience, not only my patients, not only their parents who come, but also to make sure my colleague had a good experience, and also the student in genetic counseling would also learn from that practice. So you have to be prepared. So when I came today, we then saw 6 patients, and what that entailed is for some of those patients, I went in first, and I have 30 to 45 minutes with those patients. Some patients are coming in where they already have a diagnosis, and they want me to give them a game plan. Some people suspect they have a diagnosis, like someone was very flexible and said, do I have something called hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome? So we did a physical exam and talked about that, gave the diagnosis, and then gave the game plan. Some other people were returning today because it was their second or third visit with me. We had ordered genetic testing. That testing had come back, and I needed to give a result to them. Some other people were coming because we didn't find any results to the genetic testing, and they wanted to know what, if anything, should be done. So this morning, it was a myriad of different options. We had people who came who were well into their senior years, finally deciding to get genetic testing done, and those who were itsy bitsy babies just born, looking to see if we could find a clarifying diagnosis. When I'm practicing medical genetics, we're trying to either bring an end to a diagnostic odyssey, give clarification on what is the name of that condition that might synthesize and explain all the conditions. If we do find a name, then sometimes we are there to provide healthcare maintenance, like we do in the Down syndrome clinic that I run, where we're following people with Down syndrome. We know the diagnosis, but we want to make sure that the medical playbook is followed so that they're leading the most productive and healthy lives possible, playing offense rather than defense. And then sometimes we're there to emotionally catch and support families, to take them along that journey where the science might be done and set aside, but making sure that they understand what the consequences are and what that means for their family, and how best to optimize the utility and the happiness within their family. When that clinic was done, where we had to package things up, order things, get genetic testing done, working closely with a genetic counselor, who quite frankly not only made the clinical experience better for many of my patients, but also helped me out and was able to take care of a lot of the details. So I could say, let's order this test, but I didn't have to go through the mechanics of ordering that. I didn't have to worry about the shipping of that out, took care of some of those details so that my brain was able to move on to the next step. And that is pack up and put my shoes on and get to the other building, where I had a conference call from noon to 1, where I serve on several national committees. Many of us volunteer our times for advocacy organizations or professional organizations. There is an international Down syndrome research organization where a collection of physician scientists get together to try to push the field forward for people with Down syndrome. I'm on the executive committee, the board for that. And so we had a meeting in order to come up with new grant ideas and how we were going to continue to push that mission forward. During that meeting, of which I went off camera, I was munching on lunch because I knew right after that I was leading a conference call, and this was going to be from 1 to 2. And this is where I shifted midstream to being a researcher in an academic setting. So after doing a randomized controlled trial for a grant that we got in order to create an online platform for people with Down syndrome, we then launched that, and we have a commercial enterprise within our hospital where we're trying to democratize healthcare for people with Down syndrome. Not everyone can make it to see me in Boston at Mass General Hospital. In fact, 95% of people with Down syndrome do not have access to a specialist. And so we've created this online platform so they could get that information. But every week from 1 to 2, I meet with our operationals team to go through how is it working? What are our customers saying? How do we get the reach out there? We're hiring a social media and communications manager, reviewing those applications. It's an exciting part of my day because it is applying the business sense, the kind of health economic sense, and the public policy part of my brain that I love to do beyond being a clinician. When that call was done, I was back now in the office, and I had an hour scheduled to answer email and return patient results. my day, I'm a scheduled person. So if it's on my calendar, I'll do it. If it's not on my calendar, I don't do it. I could tell you next Wednesday when I'll be checking my email because it's all on there. So I had my hours worth of email and patient results. And then the final 3 hours left in my afternoon was writing those patient notes. So all those patients I saw in the morning, it takes hours to write those notes, got to get done, got to be accurate, got to get out there to make sure they're done. Even if someone is prepping some of those notes, like my genetic counselor did, I'm ultimately responsible for what's in there to make sure it's accurate. So I went through that and finalized those. Then it was back home. I try to end my day every day at 5 o'clock. One of the reasons why I went into medical genetics is while I love medicine deeply, I also love lots of other parts of life, and that's spending time with my wife, making dinner together, also playing squash, also meeting with friends, reading, getting out there, enjoying Boston, the city I live. And the lifestyle of being a medical geneticist means I do not need to work around the clock unless I choose to do so. So that is a day in the life of me. It's kind of a practical sampling of what does it really mean to be a physician researcher. And one day I saw patients, I wrote notes, I got to participate in some advocacy efforts and also participated in some research. And on any given day, that balance is going to be different. Some days it's all research, some days it's all clinic, and some days it's a combination of both. This leads me with my one piece of advice, and that is when you meet a medical geneticist, it's somehow unsavory to ask about salaries. We don't even ask each other, how much do you make? But I think it's really important as a trainee to ask someone. I know I've been to a lecture. There's lots of different ways you put together your day. I know there's research, there's industry, there's clinic, there's advocacy. Can I ask your salary? What are the different components that go into it? Because at the end of the day, when you're a practicing physician, we all need a paycheck. But where does that paycheck come from? Where does my paycheck come from? Just a small percentage of that comes from the hospital who pays me to see patients. Why? They pay me to see patients when I see them, but I only had 2 clinics per week and I get paid for what I see. So it means the rest of my paycheck needs to come from either my administrative duties. So I have some administrative duties overseeing a team of people, and I get paid for that in part through an endowment, in part through some administrative funds. But a big part of my salary comes from myself. I have to write grants competitively. I have to get rejected from those grants. I have to write them again, get rejected again, and finally get those grants to do the research I want. And as part of that research budget includes part of my salary. If there's a year where I run out of grants, my salary will go down. If there is a time where I have lots of research grants, my salary will go up. It's a little bit of a topsy-turvy way to live because there are times where you're high and there's times where you're struggling. So going into research and medicine, you need to know, where does your salary come from? There are many of my colleagues who have full, robust careers as clinical geneticists, and 100% of their salary comes from seeing patients. But they see lots of patients, lots of time. Get to know them and see if that's the lifestyle for you. For many people, it's very fulfilling. Other people go into industry, as you heard, and you could see that their salary will come either from their own funding or from their industry, very fulfilling. And there are some people who try to patch it together like a quilt, like I do, in a crazy way. It is still fun, it's important, but there are stresses that are involved in that. So again, I always think it's important as you're trying to make a career decision and you're narrowing down the field of genetics, because as Jonathan mentioned, why would you choose anything else? Now that you've chosen genetics, it is what type of geneticist do you want to be, and how ultimately will your salary package come together? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian, for sharing your wonderful perspective as well. And I guess I do round out the group as a primarily clinical biochemical geneticist and clinical geneticist. So I do spend a lot of my time seeing patients. And then my other hat that I wear is really on quality improvement around how do we standardize care and work on patient care experiences and improving patient care and patient safety. So a lot of different perspectives on this call, and we likely might not get to everyone's question today. There are plenty of opportunities to reach out to Rare New England if there's a question we did not get to, but I'd love to have all of our panel come on camera, and I'm gonna start to throw some questions out at the group, and certainly if no one volunteers to answer them, I may pick on you, or if there's a question I think is pertinent, I might pick on you too. But I think the first question that we get asked a lot is, I'm an undergraduate student and I'm really interested in exploring the field of genetics. How do I do that? Or I'm a medical student and I really I think this could be the career for me, but I want to have some more experiences rotating through clinics. Give me some advice on how I can make those connections and get to learn more about the field to see if it's the right fit for me.
Well, maybe I'll kick off and say, I would say, best thing to do is reach out. If you're around here, there's a ton of hospitals. There's MGH, Brigham and Women's Children's Hospital. If you're somewhere else, there will be hospitals where there's geneticists. Reach out to them. My experience has been geneticists are amongst the most approachable and friendly doctors that there are there. And we're all very excited, as I hope you could see from how we were talking, about the work that we do. And in a sense, there's a little bit of proselytizing. So if you reach out and see if you can have a one-to-one conversation, or at the very least, you get some recommendations from names. So you may not know, do I want to be a clinical geneticist? Do I want to be a researcher? Do I want to be in industry? The thing is, whoever you reach out to, whether it's a physician or somebody in pharma or somewhere else, we're a small community, as I think Amy said right at the beginning. We all know people in all these different fields, and we know the right people to recommend you to. So I would say very much try and talk with somebody, and we'll introduce you to other people if that's what's right. And then you get that very personal experience and your questions answered.
Yeah, I'd say at Boston Children's Hospital, it's very common for either college level or med school level students to spend a month doing an elective, rotating either through the clinic or the inpatient service for a month, sometimes longer, either during the summer or during the school year. If you have specific interests in genetics, every hospital has a website. You can go into the genetics department section. You could look what kind of diseases people specialize in. There might be one in particular, whether it's Fragile X syndrome. You might contact Jonathan and see whether you can spend time in his clinic, or if it's metabolic disorders, contact Amy, or Down syndrome, contact Brian. Otherwise, you can just contact the head administrator of the department and say, I'd like to spend a month rotating in the clinic. How do I go about doing that? In industry, generally, because it is more of a for-profit business, there are internships that are available that you go through human resources. It might be for a summertime, might be part of the school year. Oftentimes there are programs like at Northeastern where there's kind of a work study type program where people do internships. It's possible to work at companies, either in the laboratory or on the clinical development side. So lots of opportunities there for the taking. I think it's just a matter of, you taking the first step, and then from there, doors will open.
The only thing I would add to those two great suggestions is when you do observe, when you are shadowing, it's appropriate in the back of your mind to size up where is that person in their training. So if you happen to spend a lot of time with a resident or a fellow, just know that that lifestyle is temporary. They are working extra hard hours, and that's not necessarily a representative example of what a full-blown life as an attending is, but it's important to know that's the training you would have to go through. Equally, if you're shadowing or observing someone who is a CEO or has started 10 companies or have been in the field for a long time, that's also not necessarily realistic when you first come off. It takes a lot of work to get to that position. So just kind of chronicle how long has this person been, where are they? And maybe that's kind of what life looks like at that stage, because the stages of our development is correlated with what we end up doing.
And I think to add to that, just to cover, outside of clinical genetics, if you're someone who's looking for a research experience in an academic lab, go on the website, look at the different labs, see what they're studying, see what you might be interested in. Often when you kind of know what you're looking for, it's easier for people to point you in the right direction. And then also if it's a program, a center that has an academic program, a fellowship training program, often there's already an infrastructure for bringing students in through the fellowship director, who often is also involved in other trainee level positions. So I think the first step, as everyone said, reach out, reach out, reach out. Most of us are really excited to help people find their path, especially if it's to the field of genetics, but certainly if it's not, then also to getting to the right people. So to move on to our next question that came to us prior is, oh, sorry, I'm just trying to pull up the right list of questions. In what ways do you engage in, I think we heard a little bit of this from Jonathan earlier, but in what ways do you engage in health equity and advocacy work and social justice work in your career as a clinical geneticist? I can start. I have an example since I knew the question was coming. So one of the things that we've noticed is we really started looking at our clinical patient population, just trying to understand were there barriers to getting in the door to get a genetic diagnosis. And certainly if you look at a lot of the health equity work in genetics, that there are certainly populations that come to clinical diagnosis later, come with more significant clinical presentations. And so one of the things that we've been looking at this last year has been what we call our missed opportunity rate, how often patients aren't able to come to a clinic visit. And we started to stratify that by language and found that there was a 3-time higher missed opportunity or no-show rate for patients who were non-English speaking and specifically were Spanish speaking. And so we've really launched a project this year to really understand what those barriers are and how we could begin to support patients in a way that would make sure that they were able to have successful clinic visits to get their diagnostics or their treatment that they need. And so, you know, I think one of the ways is really to recognize, as I think you've heard, that genetics has not always been equal across the board. And so trying to figure out where the barriers are and how we address that in a way that supports all patients and families has become a really important topic.
Amy, I could also share a little bit of my experience. I also got a master's in public policy from the Kennedy School of Government, because a big part of what I do in taking care of people with Down syndrome is realizing all the social and societal barriers that are in the way. So oftentimes it's not genetics, it's not science, but it's society that's getting in the way. And so I wanted to have a better understanding of how I could use those tools on behalf of my patients. What does that practically mean? Now that I'm all grown up, so to speak, it means that oftentimes I'm called to the State House with the local advocacy groups in order to testify. I'm very comfortable doing that because I know the process, I know our patients, so I'm able to give that in order to advocate for better laws or various advocacies that should be changed. And then also, I continue to volunteer for several disability-related advocacy organizations. And I've kind of grown up in that movement. But I also mentioned that as you get older or more kind of fine-tuned, your volunteering could also be more specific to your skill level. So when I first started volunteering, for example, for the Massachusetts Down Syndrome Organization, I could offer being a sibling. That was my expertise. I had no medical knowledge, no scientific knowledge. So I helped do some of their sibling programs. And then I started going through medical school and I started gaining medical knowledge. And now I see patients with Down syndrome. And so I'm still volunteering for that organization, but I'm volunteering in the capacity as one of their medical and scientific advisory council leaders. And so I'm able to give my knowledge back in a different way. And I think that's another beautiful thing is as you gain these skills in particular conditions or disease states, you also have an opportunity to the extent that your time allows to give back to the community with a knowledge set that's kind of matched to your volunteerism.
I would say for the past few years, I've served on the national board of directors of actually the oldest patient advocacy group in the US, the National Tay-Sachs and Allied Diseases Group. And this is a group that advocates for several rare disorders, Tay-Sachs, Sandhoff, Canavan, and GM1 gangliosidosis. And for probably 55 of the last 60 years that the organization's been around, there's been no treatment for any of these. And now there are clinical trials ongoing for each of these conditions. So it's very exciting time period. And I joined the board at that time because I knew that there were going to be a lot of opportunities for patients to get involved with clinical trials, and that the patients would need some guidance on what it meant to actually participate in a clinical trial. Because remember, these are investigational drugs. They're not proven drugs. In fact, sometimes we just call them investigational products because a drug kind of implies that it's already been tested for safety and efficacy. So, in some respects, people are offering themselves up as guinea pigs to determine whether or not the drug, will be beneficial for them. But these types of advocacy organizations are really important because with these very rare diseases, oftentimes big companies are not interested in developing drugs for such small patient populations. And so groups like NTSAD and others, they can really take their own destiny in their own hands. They can raise money through donations. This group raises about $1 million a year, and a certain amount of that goes towards funding research programs or clinical trials that ultimately will benefit the patients. So it's really great being on the patient side of things and having that perspective and help address some of the questions they have about clinical trials and participation in research studies.
Great, and to switch gears to a new topic, just because I think we get this question a lot, is one person had written in, I'm a public health student, and how can I pursue a career in genetics? And to expand that, what are other ways that people who are interested in the field of genetics, but who are not MDs or PhDs, can choose to pursue careers that are supportive of patients with genetic diseases and the field of genetics in general?
Well, I could describe our Down syndrome multidisciplinary clinic, where a physician is just one of many roles that is necessary. So there are lots of different support staff who make that experience meaningful for our families. It starts with the administrators behind the scenes who field the phone calls, who schedule the multidisciplinary day and put it all together. We cannot do it without our patient service coordinators and those who have very sharp clinical and administrative acumen. And then during the day itself, patients are seen not only by the physician, but also by our team of social workers. We couldn't do it without all the care coordination that goes on. Sign up for this resource. I need to connect you with this. What is Social Security? How do we, our social workers are oftentimes one of the people who are the first thanked by our patients when they remember their experience. Nutritionists. Those who want to go into nutritional health. So many of our metabolic and our genetic conditions really do require hand and glove treatment from our nutritionists. And then we have those who are audiologists who are trained in there, psychometricians, psychologists, therapists who are continuing to see our patients, and those who are resource specialists. For those who don't want to hover within even the clinical space, even though there's lots of non-MD roles, there's lots of roles that you could play in the advocacy organizations. So the nonprofit Down syndrome organizations and disability-based organizations are run by people who have leadership expertise and nonprofit expertise, fundraising expertise in order to make that happen, all making sure that patients with various conditions get advocated for. And then also I would argue on the governmental side. So we need to make sure there's champions both at the State House and at the Federal House, and there are many people who pursue a advocacy or a lobbyist role in advocating for people with disabilities. So lots of different ways in. Those are just some examples. And
from the public health perspective, I would say, how do we find our patients? How do we reach out to them? Whether we're looking for them clinically to provide treatment, or we're looking to see if we can carry out research if they'd be interested in being involved, or just to get word out. This requires skills that clinical geneticists don't necessarily have, and we absolutely rely on others. I talked about that condition, Handy-Godu syndrome. Well, I was alerted to this by a cytogeneticist who learned about it from a public health doctor, who himself learned about it from a social worker. There were many steps along the way, but knowing the different routes and paths that you can take to find people, and as Brian said, to get the government and other stakeholders on your side, this requires a lot of skills and specializations, and critically important.
Wonderful. And there's, I think, a question in the chat that I think some folks are frantically checking, typing answers to. So there's a question about, if you see patients clinically, what percentage of patients do you see are new patients followed only for a couple of visits? What percentage are followed more continuously or over time? What's that ratio look like? I can certainly start that and say it really depends on the person and what their field is. So in my field of biochemical genetics, many of these, most of my patients are return patients to me. I've known some of these patients for a decade. It's really fun. I've been able to see them go from babies to toddlers, or from young children to now in college. We support women during pregnancies, and then depending on the condition, might take care of their child as well if it's a dominant condition. So I think it really depends on what you do, but certainly one of the things that brought me to genetics was the desire to have continuity of care. It was very important for me to be able to really know my patients well and to feel like I am part of their living well with a chronic disease. And so for me, that was a huge part of why I went into this field.
I think as well, over time, the proportion changes. So when you're relatively new to the field, you have a lot of new people, and some of them may only see you once or twice, but you accrue more and more. So next month, for instance, I am seeing a patient that I first saw on my very first week on call, which was with Jerry Cox. The baby was born. I won't say how old he is now, but he's an adult. And I see him next month.
And then I had shared in the type, for those of us who have specialty clinics, like Down syndrome or Fragile X or what have you, it really is a nice cohort that you have the luxury of kind of following throughout a lifetime. So for our Down syndrome clinic, which is at capacity, so those who are in, we're all going to grow old together. And so we see them once a year for a lifetime.
That's great. And then given how rapidly things change in genetics, what's one way that you stay up to date and that you engage with your colleagues to help make sure that people have the best information about genetic conditions?
Couple of practical steps is, for those of us who have academic appointments, there tend to be grand rounds, or what we call a conference, where we get together and there usually is a speaker on various topics. It is oftentimes a requirement if you're part of a division, and it's just a natural way if you attend those to get updated information on how things are happening. Another way is there's national conferences and organizations. So we all belong to different societies that tend to hold once a year meetings. You go there, and for 3 to 5 days, you can attend as many PAC sessions as you want to bring you up to date. Which is oftentimes a nice way of getting a very concentrated update and also connecting with your colleagues and friends who are across the globe. And then there's always read your journals, right? And it always seems like there should be more time. But as research is coming out, many of us have our favorite journals that we follow. And oftentimes we have little ticklers to say, if something's published on my case, Down syndrome, I better know about it. And so if there's a new article comes out, I do my best to try to read it.
And from an industry perspective, we always need people to carry out the clinical trials. So, hospitals like Boston Children's or Mass General will often be engaged in clinical research, which involves patients, and they may serve as an investigator. And I would say that I certainly became much better informed about a particular disease by developing a treatment for it, because once a treatment or a suspected treatment becomes available, people are clamoring at the door to either learn about it if you're on the physician side, or potentially get access to it if you're on the patient side. So a lot of the newer potential treatment opportunities, people get access to at the major hospitals as well.
The other thing I would add is, Brian had mentioned earlier, the hours you spend before clinic preparing. Genetics is a field where people come to find out what is known, what is understood. And a large part of those hours is reading up on the disorder that the patient has that you're going to be seeing, or the symptoms that relate to the disorder, so you can understand. So the very nature of doing clinic in genetics forces us to be up to date, which I think is actually one of the exciting things about the field, because it never gets boring. It's every clinic is new knowledge.
I will say the other nice thing about our field is because we do have to spend so much time making sure we're up to date on information, we actually have a lot more time with our patients than a lot of other fields of medicine. So in a full clinical day for me, if I'm doing clinic from 8 to 5, I will usually see somewhere between 8 to 10 patients. So I generally have 45 minutes to an hour to see each patient. Which is really amazing when you compare some other fields where it's just, constant next patient. So it does give you a little extra room in your schedule if someone's running late or if you're running late. Also allows you to be more flexible if I need an urgent patient to get in, and to give you extra time if you need to do care coordination or other things for those patients. So I think even as a full-time clinician, a career in genetics is there's time. And I think that's one of the things that I like the most about it, is that I actually have a lot of time to really get to know my patients. And I think we are just about at the hour. I'm happy if people have other questions that we didn't get to. I'm happy to have Rare New England share my contact information. If there are questions that people have, I'm happy to talk further. And as everyone has said here, genetics is a very close-knit group. We have lots of friends and colleagues all over the state and the New England and across the US, and for some of us more than others internationally. But we love to talk to people. We love what we do, and we really would love to have more people coming into this field to support amazing colleagues and amazing families.
Thank you so much, Amy, for hosting this evening. And thank you to our physician speakers, Dr. Picker, Cox, and Scott Coe. We really appreciate all of you sharing your professional experiences working in genetics and contributing to our career fairs. It's so valuable. And thank you again to all of our attendees who are with us tonight. We'll be sending you all a DoorDash gift card shortly following the event, as well as information on future educational opportunities by early next week. So please be on the lookout for those. To learn more about Rare New England and to stay up to date with all that we're doing, please visit our website at www.rarenewengland.org, and feel free to email us at info@rarenewengland.org to join our mailing list. Thank you again to everyone, and we appreciate you all. Have a great night.
Thanks.
Bye.
All right.